right, good morning, everybody. I find myself in the unenviable position of being between you and a break. But rest assured, it's only 15 minutes, and we'll try to make it worthwhile. First, I will tell you that unfortunately, I am a fraud. I am not a global manager of data center operations. I'm actually on the product team at Duo within Cisco. And in fact, the end of the last panel was a pretty good segue into some of the things we're going to talk about. We were talking about sort of the overwhelmingness of cybersecurity strategy on the end user, especially as it relates to two-factor authentication, getting into systems, and making sure that the cure, so to speak, isn't worse than the disease. And when we talk about zero trust, we really know that there's a problem. We realize that in the post-COVID world, the way that users are accessing organizational resources is not how they were doing it beforehand. And I'm sure many of us in this room know that, but our end users and many of the organizations we work with, unfortunately, don't seem to have gotten the memo that the perimeter is broken. The single points of failure represented by things like VPN access or centralized data repositories are just not working for us in a world where people have to be able to work from home. They have to be able to work from multiple types of devices, and we still need to be able to protect them in a way that isn't so onerous that they don't just decide to use their Gmail account, because much easier to store a document there than to go through multiple steps of authentication to use a corporate SharePoint site or something like that. So the consequences is that identity theft continues to be the #1 cause of breaches amongst users. It's down from 95% of attacks involving it down to somewhere in the 80s, but that's not a great number either, to be honest. And the reality is that interfacing with passwords, especially with users not being in the office, is actually getting more expensive because it's much more difficult to help a user who can't bring their device in for service very easily, and rather you have to help them over the phone to get them back into some system they're trying to access. And a single point of failure of that can really cause a lot of problems for organizations, both financially and in terms of time, which is sometimes even more valuable. So what we really want to think about in a zero trust approach is the fact that there is no one single thing that we can do that's going to protect the entire organization. That instead, because users are coming from different places, using different types of devices, we actually need to establish a network of control points that allow us to look at a number of different areas that are important. We break it down into really 3 different silos that are sort of arbitrary but have some meaning. The first is the workforce, and that deals with anything where a human being is interfacing with a device. Right? So we need to know something about the human being. They need to prove who they are in some way. We also need to know about the device. Right? And we need to understand that that device is a device that even if the user is legitimate, that we would trust to hold important data. We also need to, of course, assure ourselves that the applications they're accessing, that are talking to each other across the network, are doing the things they're supposed to do. One of my favorite examples is that lots of organizations in their break room have new smart fridges. And the great thing about that is that if you're running out of milk, it knows, and it can get on Amazon. It can tell Amazon, get me more milk. But it can also connect to anything else on the internet that it wants to connect to. And so if that device is not well secured, then the entire security strategy for the network inside the perimeter is broken, because that device can now become a rogue agent on the network doing really whatever its owner wants it to do. So there's all these little different spots in the network that we really want to have a control point. And what I'm going to focus on is, especially because of what we do at Duo, is that workforce side of things, where users are interfacing with things. Because when we realize that it's important to check both the user and the device, something else becomes true. There's a new way that we can establish trust. And quickly, looking at our own data, because we collect a lot of data about the millions upon millions of authentications that happen to our service every single year, we look at the different things that our users tell us they are looking at as things that are important when it comes to identifying and establishing trust. Certainly user identity, but also their location is important. Their behavior is important. What's normal for that user? Do they log into that application every day, or is that a bit of an outlier? Do they do it at 3 a.m. very often? That might be a little strange. And also, again, device identity, device hygiene. Is that a corporate device? Is that a personal device? Should I allow it to have data on it, even if it is a legitimate user trying to log in? What they don't tell us is that the password is something they love, and certainly in the post-COVID world, where they are on the network doesn't really matter anymore either. So this leads us to a realization that there's an evolution going on. We started off with username and password. We had that for a good 40 years without really doing anything to it. Then we realized, well, static usernames and passwords, we're getting breached a lot with that. So we need to do something else. And so we moved into credentials, username and password, plus something else, multi-factor authentication. That was a great evolution. But of course, attackers aren't stupid and they're not static. And so what we're seeing now is attackers flooding authentication systems with just so many notifications over and over and over and over again until the person gets so fatigued with that notification, they just approve it to make it go away. Now you're breached. And that's not because there was something wrong with the encryption. It's not because there was something wrong with the theory. It's just because humans, well, we're human. We make mistakes, right? So we realized, though, that if you're making security decisions as part of authentication based on the hygiene and the state of that device anyway, what we're starting to see is, in fact, your identity as someone working in an organization is starting to merge with that of your device, and that we can actually leverage that to make ourselves more secure. That you plus your device in any work environment should be together. And so if you're not together, that's a problem. And if you are together, you represent one entity. And so that's brought around this new evolution, which we like to call passwordless. And in the passwordless world, we've got two things. Neither of them is a username or a password. We've got a biometric, something that I am, that allows me to prove that I'm who I say I am. And we have a cryptographic key pair stored securely on the device that identifies the device and which can only be unlocked by said biometric. Now I've got a new identity that's the combination of me and my device that allows me to prove that both are trustworthy, right? And we're seeing that this is actually hugely exploding in adoption for one really important reason. How many steps does it take to log in using passwordless from a user perspective? 1. So we've gone from username plus password plus PIN code or push notification plus, in some cases, to try to deal with these push phishing attacks, an extra code that you have to identify on the screen and then select in your application. We're up to 3 or 4 steps. We've gone from that all the way down to 1 step again. But it's still multi-factor authentication, right? Because remember, we're checking you biometrically. We're checking your device, its hygiene, its status, whether it's a corporate device or not. We may check your behavior, right? If you're logging in at 3 a.m., that could be something that we might want to block anyway, right? So it's still very much a multi-factor authentication, but we're back to 1 step of authentication. And that helps to solve a lot of what the folks on the previous panel were talking about in terms of overwhelming users. Because especially with the advent of things like Face ID on your phone, Windows Hello on laptops and desktops, authentication is actually coming back to a place where logging in means look at your screen. Most users can do that, I find. Generally speaking, when I talk to users, are you able to look at your screen? Yes, I am. You don't even need to be able to see the screen. The screen just needs to be able to see you, right? And you're logged in, but you've done a multi-factor, cryptographically secure authentication. So that's exploding. We think that's an amazing thing. One of the things people always ask me when I talk about passwordless is, well, what if my device doesn't do biometrics? That's actually okay. As you'll be familiar with from most of your phones, and maybe if you're doing Windows Hello, there's an option to do a PIN. And people say, well, that's just the same as a password. In fact, it's worse than a password. It's just a bunch of numbers. That's easily cracked. Seems that way, but it's actually not true. There's a key difference when we talk about passwordless as a method of authentication versus a password. And the difference with that PIN is that it's not going anywhere. Right? So when you put a password into an application, you are sending, generally speaking, a hash of that password to some other system. That system compares the hash of your password to what it has stored, figures out whether it's you or not. In the world of even a PIN-based passwordless authentication, that PIN is simply unlocking a key that lives only on your phone, nowhere else. That key is then used to sign a message to the target application, meaning your PIN never leaves your local device, making it a much different threat model than that of a password where you're sending it all over the place and you're only as secure as the weakest place that's storing a hash of your password. And so the last thing I want to talk about is where does that go from there? Because that's actually not, in our view, the last step. So we actually think that a much more broad digital identity future beckons. we're already starting to see bits of it appear, both in Europe with the IDAS 2 standard that's being worked on. We see Apple working on it in their efforts to digitize driver's licenses in at least 13 states in the US, where we're actually going to be able to move away from another point of failure in our system, which is that all of these identities that we're talking about, as much as we're securing them digitally after an employee onboards, are based on physical documents fundamentally. And before COVID, it wasn't great, but it was a little better because most of the time we'd have that person come into the office, we'd actually have a look at those documents, right? And we could make a value judgment. Seems legit, right? And then we would go through the process of onboarding them. Nowadays, I've spoken to numerous HR directors who say, well, most of the time, we generally let the employee send us a photo of the document. So now we're taking a plastic card or a paper document that wasn't really all that secure to begin with. We're reducing that to a at least somewhat pixelated, compressed digital image of that document. And on the basis of that, we're making onboarding decisions. Now, of course, we're sending these off for background checks and theoretically going through a lot of due diligence, but those same HR directors tell me that more often than they would like to admit, they're having to claw back laptops and credentials they've given to somebody because the background check just took so long that they let the person start anyway, and it turned out they lied, and now we have a potential breach on our hands because who knows who that person really was while they had their laptop. So what we're seeing coming out of passwordless is another step, which is to say, okay, I now have a device, I don't have a username, I don't have a password, it knows who I am through a cryptographic relationship. Now, I'm not storing my password anywhere. Well, what if we did that also for my personal details? What if instead of storing them in a centralized honeypot that every hacker would love to get into, I store a lot of my personal details on my phone, and I use digital signatures to validate that that information hasn't changed or been tampered with. And so instead of having that all in one centralized place, we spread that out a bit too and have that tied to a relationship with a device as well. Well, from a user perspective, it's fantastic because it means that all the things that are hard for me as a legitimate person right now, getting a new ID when I lose it, having more than one copy in case, I leave one behind, those all become easy for a legitimate user. For a bad guy, right now, if I want to print a copy of a fake ID, that's pretty easy. People do that all the time. Teenagers manage to pull that off to get into bars. But as a legitimate user, I'm actually not even allowed to do that. It's not even legal. This allows us to flip that on its head. Makes life really, again, very, very easy for the legitimate user, much more difficult for the bad guy, and it means that I only need to share the details I want to, and it's a one-step process. I just look at my phone and go click, and I'm logged in. I've proved who I am. I've proved that the device I'm using is trustworthy, right? And that's it. And in the background, we can do all the hard work, right? We can say, hey, is that my corporate device? Is the hygiene up to date? Is it 3 a.m. in the morning? Is it a weird application? All the different patterns we want to analyze to assure that ourselves that it's secure, we can simply do in the background, and our users just don't have to think about it anymore. So that's sort of where we think things are going. I think it's pretty exciting personally because I think it solves a lot of problems that we've just sort of accepted were unsolvable for a while, and it turns out that with new technology, they're not. So, to summarize all that, start off by building solid access controls now. Certainly, if you're not doing MFA, do it, but we would say consider doing it passwordlessly. And don't be concerned about the fact that you may have legacy hardware in the environment. Even if you have to fall back on a PIN, it's actually better than a password. So take the plunge, it's not as difficult as you think. Look at the processes around that as well, though, because that comes all the way back to how did I onboard somebody at the very beginning in the organization? Did I actually validate those documents? Even if HR validated those documents, does IT have the ability to go back and follow that chain of custody to know that the person they're sending a laptop to is really that person? Because if not, it's all for nothing. Understand those authentication factors and the policies that you really care about, and sort of see whether you can start to merge those together into a combined identity between the user themselves and the device they're carrying with them. And keep an eye out as digital identity develops, because I think it's going to make a lot of these problems even easier, and it'll be good for both the user's own privacy and for the organization's data security. Thank you very much.